GameMasters here, and in our last video we went over all of the major things that you would need in order to play Dungeons & Dragons, from either running the game or actually playing the game. And that was simply the Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual, if you're going to run it, and if you're going to play it, the Player's Handbook, and of course, dice. So today, I would like to take a slightly more in-depth look at the Player's Handbook. And the first thing that I always like to take a look at the very beginning of it, there's always a disclaimer. And this one in the Player's Handbook is, Wizards of the Coast is not responsible for the consequences of splitting up the party. Sticking appendages in the mouth of a leering green devil face. Now that's an in-joke or an allusion to one of the original versions, covers of the Player's Handbook. Accepting a dinner invitation from bugbears, storming the feast hall of a hill giant steading, angering a dragon of any variety, or saying yes when the DM asks, "Are you really sure?" It's just a neat little bit of flavor text there. But in today's video, what I want to go over are the very beginning portions of the Player's Handbook. In future days, we'll go over each section of the Player's Handbook. But today, we are going to concentrate on the preface, the introduction, and how to play the game itself. Now, the book itself, the Player's Handbook, is separated into three parts. You have part one, which is creating the character. Part two is playing the game. And part two you can see is not very thick. And part three is the rules of magic. This is going to explain all your spells and everything that you get to cast at each other. So, with the first section, you've got the preface. Mike Mearls wrote the preface. Those of you that are somewhat familiar with Dungeons & Dragons know that Mike Mearls had a major influence on the early stages of 5th edition. Then you have the introduction, and it basically goes over various aspects of kind of how your turn is going to go. And it's got a couple of excerpts from what the Dungeon Master would cite versus what the players would say. And then what the Dungeon Master says versus how the players will interact with that, with their surroundings or their environment. You have Worlds of Adventure, which basically goes down, it explains, okay, getting a touch ahead of myself here, but basically think about it in terms of what Marvel, the MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe, is doing currently with their movies. They're trying to have a whole bunch of little movies tie into one big central theme, overall universe. Now they're going to call that the multiverse. Well, Dungeons & Dragons is very similar. And in their multiverse, they have different elemental planes. You've got fire, water, earth, etc. But there are also different lands. For example, you have Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Greyhawk, Dark Sun, Mystara, Eberron, Spelljammer. There are all kinds of different settings in Dungeons & Dragons. And that's the thing that makes it so much fun, is if you don't like one setting, you can go check out a different setting. Each setting has its own group of lore, or its own history and its own lore, different characters. Very rarely will you see characters jump from one faction of the multiverse to a different area, but it has happened in the distant past. Not so much in 5th edition, and I understand too that there's been a recent comment come out about what's considered canon and versus what's not canon, but we're not going to get into that in this video. It also talks about how to use this book. Part 1, and I was talking about parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 basically states that it's all about creating the character, provides the rules and guidance you need in order to make the character that you're going to play in the game. Part 2 details out the rules of the game and really how you're going to play. the limitations of what your character can do and all of the different options that you have available to you. And then part 3, again, like I mentioned earlier, is all about magic. States that it covers the nature of magic and the worlds of D&D, rules for spellcasting, that kind of thing. And then you have how to play. So this one is, again, this little section is broken into 3 areas, but how to play. So essentially the DM is going to describe the environment. You and your party are in a forbidden forest. It's silent all around, except for the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional gust of wind. But there is a very foul stench in the air. And then it's the player's turn, part 2 here, to describe what they want to do. Well, let's see. We would like to take our torches out and look around the base of each tree and see if we see any signs of animals moving around or monsters lurking. And the DM will go, "Are you sure you want to light that torch?" Just to be mean with the players. And then, of course, the DM in the third part narrates the results of the adventurer's actions. So that's when they'll go, "Yeah, we're sure. We want to light a torch." The DM will go, "Okay." They'll roll some dice, pretend to know what the numbers mean, and then they'll go, "Okay, you light the torch, and you're suddenly attacked by all types of darkness, shadows coming out of everywhere, envelop those flames. Roll for initiative." And then combat begins. Now, with that, we have game dice. And that's really what we're going to use, focus this particular video on, are the different types of dice. While I'm thinking about it, one thing that I would like for you all to do, I would love it if you could just pause for a moment, take some time, go down there to that little thumbs up and give me a thumbs up, like the video, share it with as many people as you can. I would genuinely appreciate that. That helps to get this out, helps to get my channel out there for everybody else in the world to see. And that's ultimately why I'm trying to do this, is to get as many eyes on my videos as possible. And I would genuinely thank you for that. So, dice can be your friends, or they can be your worst enemy in almost any game that uses them. They're the very definition of a random number generator, and man, you know, those numbers can really smack you upside the head. Thankfully, there are plenty of things in Dungeons & Dragons that will help give you an edge, and those are called modifiers. Those are basically numbers that you can add to your random number generator. So in Dungeons & Dragons, there are 7 different types of dice. You've got, let me go ahead and separate those out. Actually, we're going to go with the green ones here. Green, blue, and pink. How's that? And I think I've got some down here too. I have dice everywhere. So you've got a D4, also known as the Tetrahedron. And as I've gotten older, the dexterity in my fingers has really begun to fail me. And I hate these dice. They're difficult to pick up. They hurt like hell if you step on them. Their nickname is called the caltrop. The D4 is mostly used when trying to determine damage for small weapons and how much your healing spell is healed for. This might be one that you want to have multiples of, especially if you're going to be a healer, because you're going to find instances in which you'll be able to heal for more than just 1d4 damage or 1d4 health. It's also not the best dice to use when you get mad and throw them. They don't have much weight to them, so as a result they'll just hit the wall and kind of just plink off. Of course, when they land on the floor, you're going to risk caltropping, and yeah, I think I just made that word up. That'll hurt your foot. But don't worry, I'm going to recommend the best dice that you can throw a little bit further down the list. Next, you have your D6, The D6 is also known as a cube. It's perhaps the most famous die out there, and these guys date back to about 2500 BC. Now, most folks know this type of die from games like Monopoly, Yahtzee, that kind of thing. The D6 is one that you're going to want multiples of as well. The most common use is when you create your character. Now, while there's different methods for creating your character, most of them almost exclusively use the D6. In Dungeons and Dragons, the D6 is used for a variety of things, from how much damage is dealt to how much health you gain after a short rest. And again, multiples of these can be helpful. Then you have your D8, also known as an octahedron. The D8 looks like two pyramids standing on each other's base. These also hurt when you step on them. Now, let's be honest, all dice are going to hurt if you step on them. But these are generally used for determining how much damage your sword has done. In the earlier levels of your character, generally you will only need one of these, but as you gain levels, multiple D8s can be helpful. Warriors will generally make use of the D8 the most, as the weapons allowed to them, like long swords, flails, stuff like that, top out at doing 8 damage. But those weapons also allow the player to hold a shield in their offhand, providing good protection. The D10, also known as percentile dice, is a pentagonal trapezohedron. The D10 is similar in function to the D8 in that it is used to determine damage from a specific weapon type, two-handed weapons. When used in conjunction with the 00 numbered D10, this is the percentile portion, they can be determine your chances to accomplish a specific task. For example, if there's a 25% chance that something can happen, let's say the rogue is trying to pick a lock and there's a 25% chance that it'll spray acid in her face. Roll a percentile D10. So the first number is a 50, the second one is a 6. So she rolled it to 56. If the difficulty of picking it was 25%, she got 56%, she's able to open that lock and avoid the acid. Of course, you could also roll your D20 on various checks, perception to see if the lock is trapped, disarm if you can see, well, if you can disarm the trap, but more on the D20 in a moment. Then you have the D12. The D12 is also known as a dodecahedron, and like the others, it's also used for determining damage, mostly from larger weapons. Think about what a barbarian would carry: massive axe, two-handed sword, stuff like that. Now, don't get down, magic wheelers. There are some spells out there that you can cast that will do D12 damage as well. Stuff like poison spray, witch bolt, etc. For the most part, you really only need one of these. Unless you really like dice, then collect as many as you want. I've got several. Because of their shape, they also perform well as the base of a dice stack really well. And then you have your D20, also known as the icosahedron. This is the granddaddy of Dungeons & Dragons dice. They are used by every class pretty much the most, but you really only need one. Yeah, I know. Well, if you want more, take as many as you want. The D20 is used for determining pretty much any action performed in game. Need to swim across a raging river? Give me a D20 roll against your swimming skill. Need to climb a rope that's saturated with oil that's on fire? Give me a D20 roll against your climbing skill. Trying to bluff the merchant to give you a discount? Give me a D20 roll against your charisma. I think you just gave me everything in the shop. Each number on the die has a 5% chance of rolling face up. Generally, a roll of a 1 means you failed miserably. Either you just drowned, burnt to a crisp, or the merchant jacked the price up by 90%. A roll of a 20 is an automatic success. You swam across that river carrying the rogue on your back, you clambered up that rope, put the fire out, and reclaimed the oil, or the merchant just flat out gave you the item you wanted to buy. The D20 is going to be your best friend, or your worst enemy. They're also the best dice to throw. They sound great when you hit the wall, but you do got to be careful because they can hurt when they bounce back at you. Now, you also have your D30. This is also called a rhombic dodecahedron. Now, what's the point of the D30? Well, what would you ever use it for? Well, what I've got a table that has 30 options. So, yeah, you'd use it to randomly generate one of those events, maybe. But you could also use it to randomly determine the day of the month. Of course, that assumes that your universe only ever has 30 days in it. And this is really kind of more of just a novelty item. There are a few dungeon masters that have created their own tables specifically to be rolled against the D30. But again, it's mainly just a novelty die, conversation starter. And then you have this. This is what is called a hectohetron. This is a D100. I'll give myself a little bit of space. The D100 more closely resembles a golf ball rather than a polyhedron. Its edges are very rounded, and it's, again, like the D30, very much a novelty die. Some players will use this instead of using two D10s to generate a random percentile. And I use mine for a 100 entry random spell table. Again, there's no mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons that will use a D100 other than maybe a percentile. So it's mostly used for homebrew things. The biggest issue with the D100 is that it really hates to stop rolling. Probably will stop rolling fairly easy on this because it's a softer material. Or it just stops when it hits resistance. I have to usually roll this one on a small box, and even then it's really hard to tell what side is up. Most of the time it just lands in the corner without a true face up. And I mentioned earlier that the D20 is the best one to throw, and I'm still going to maintain that statement. But yeah, if you throw this, of course this one is a solid chunk of copper. So if you throw this, it's going to hurt way worse than the D20. But is it really considered the die? I mean, you might as well chunk a golf ball instead. And why stop there? I mean, just grab the baseball next, and then grab the baseball bat after that. Now, there's many other dice out there that would fall under the category of novelty as well. But everything that I've just talked about, I really try to use on a week-to-week basis when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons. So one of the other things that I want to focus on, since we've gone over dice, push these out of the way, is getting back, you have super tiny little dice, is getting back to the D20. And as I mentioned, this is the one that's really going to be used the most. One thing, the opposite ends, the opposite end is going to be 20. So if you're ever looking for a die or a specific number on the die, all you have to do is look. So 2 and 19. So the opposite ends are always going to add up to 21. Now, on a D20, what you're going to do is, we mentioned earlier about modifiers, adding modifiers. So what you're going to do is, if the DM says, okay, well, I need a DC check on climbing. Well, that's going to be dexterity, so assume that you have a +2 in dexterity. Whatever you roll, this, you're going to add your modifier. Wow. So I got a 3, but it's a 1, which is a critical fail, so I didn't make it up the rope. We're going to try that one more time. So a 9, and then I'm going to add my 2. That gives me 11. So if the difficulty was a 7, I was able to climb up that rope. But you're going to basically roll the die and add a modifier. You'll apply any circumstantial bonuses and penalties. The DM will know if there's any penalties. For example, if the rope is oily, there'll probably be a -2, maybe a -3 to climbing, because it's slippery while you're trying to climb up that rope. And then you compare the total to a target number. Again, the DM is going to know what that target number is. For example, if trying to climb the rope, the target number that's covered in oil, the difficulty is, say, a 12. Okay, we're going to roll, add, well, I've already made that a success. But let's say I rolled a 5, I add the 2 to it, 7. I don't make it up the rope. It's too difficult for me to climb up there. You have advantage and disadvantage. So sometimes an ability check, attack roll, or saving throw is modified by special situations called advantage and disadvantage. Advantage reflects the positive circumstances surrounding a d20 roll, while disadvantage reflects the opposite. When you have either advantage or disadvantage, you roll a second d20 when you make the roll. Use the higher of the two rolls if you have advantage. Use the lower if you have disadvantage. This is something that you'll hear the term RAW. R-A-W stands for rules as written. This is one that I don't use that much in my campaign. I'm not a big fan of it. I do allow what's called a luck bonus. That's kind of a homebrew thing that I've come up with, and I'll get into that at another point. But I don't use advantage and disadvantage really at all in my games. I'm more of a purist. I would rather you roll 1d20 and that's it. Some people are going to insist, oh, but those are the rules, that's how it's written. Well, as a dungeon master, and we'll get into this when I crack open the Dungeon Master's Guide, as a dungeon master, my philosophy is I'm the one running the game, it's my rules. This is simply a guidebook, not an end-all be-all. So if your DM chooses to ignore it, great. If your DM chooses to adhere to this, that's perfectly acceptable. You've got specific beats general. What that basically means is a specific rule beats a general rule. You have rundown. This is a general rule that you need to know on the outset. Whenever you divide a number in the game, round it down. If you end up with a fraction, even if the fraction is 1/2 or greater. That's not, again, that's another element that's not really ever popped up in my campaign. As a DM, yes, there's a bit of math involved, and I do round some numbers down, I do round some numbers up. Just kind of depends on the situation at hand. And then the last part of this, of the prelude to the whole book, it talks about adventures. Adventures are basically, I mean, it's what your characters are going to do. It's the story of getting from point A to point B, finding the MacGuffin, and saving the day. And there are what they consider to be three pillars of adventure. You've got exploration, social interaction, and combat. The exploration is you're going through the forest and exploring what's there. You have the social interaction, which you run across an NPC or even your own party members, either in-game or at the table, and y'all talk about what you're going to do. And then you have combat, which is swords clashing against swords, spells being flung, that kind of thing. And then you have the wonders of magic. Dungeons & Dragons is a very fantasy-heavy game. That's dragons, they're magic. Magic is something that is very prevalent throughout the entire game. There are some campaigns that I've been in which magic is extraordinarily rare. So like playing a mage is very difficult because magic isn't supposed to exist. I've played in other campaigns in which even your most hardcore muscle-bound barbarian can sling spells. Having magic in your campaign is up to the DM to determine if that's something that they want or not. Me personally, I think it would be a shame if you didn't include magic in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. There are other game systems out there in which magic is not a prevalent aspect of it, but for the most part in Dungeons & Dragons, magic is key. Now, in the next video, we're going to go over part 1 of the Player's Handbook, and we'll actually create a character together. But one thing I'd like to know, we talked about dice. That was pretty heavy in this video. What is your favorite dice? Do you have a favorite brand or a favorite number? And as a follow-up question to that, We also saw many different shapes and sizes of dice. What are some of the crazier ones you've seen? Let me know about that in the comments below. Be sure to tune in the next couple of days as we go over part 1 of creating a character, and I'll help you create a character. Until next our paths cross, may your D20s roll higher than what I'm about to roll.